And joining us now in studio, Rebecca Saxe, Associate Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience and Principal Investigator at the Saxe Lab at MIT. Hello again.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yesterday we talked about the field of cognitive neuroscience, and today I want to talk more specifically about the kind of work you do in the field and specifically in your lab. So cognitive neuroscience developed this idea of something called the theory of the mind about a decade ago. What is this? Let's start there. What does this theory tell us?
Actually, that idea is even older, and it has Canadian roots. Oh. Part of where the notion of theory of mind and some of the earliest discoveries were made was right here in Toronto. So what that idea is that when you see people around you, you understand what they're doing, or you try to, not just in terms of their patterns of movement. It's not like watching a ball roll down a hill. What you're doing is figuring out what's making them do the things they do inside their minds. What are their motivations, their thoughts, their beliefs, their desires? What causes them to do what they do that's inside their head? That's what you want to know, right? About your friends, your colleagues, even the strangers on the street. So the idea that people interpret other people's actions in terms of the thoughts inside their heads, that's called having a theory of mind, interpreting other people in terms of a theory of their mind. And that idea came up as a way of describing what's going on as little kids get older and start to figure out that other people have different beliefs and desires from their own. Not everybody wants the same things, and not everybody knows or believes the same things. So as kids get older, basically when they're toddlers and in preschool, they're just starting to figure out how that works and starting to understand that other people who have different beliefs will act in different ways.
You know, one time or another, we all have had trouble reading what another person is thinking.
Absolutely.
But you say human beings, we're well equipped to actually do this. How are we so well equipped?
Well, so this is actually something humans are probably uniquely good at. There's a famous apocryphal quote. Somebody, and it might have been Alan Greenspan, said, "I know you think you understand what you thought I said, but I don't think you realize that what you heard was not what I meant." So that sounds like word salad, but the fact that you can put that together at all.
Say it again slowly.
I know you think you understand what you thought I said, but I'm not sure you realize that what you heard was not what I meant.
Okay.
The fact that you can put that together into any meaningful idea at all, that's in virtue of a uniquely human capacity you have to think about thoughts, inside thoughts, inside thoughts. And one of the amazing things cognitive neuroscience has shown us is that when you're doing that, there's a particular special part of your brain that's really going for it, that you use just for thinking about that kind of problem.
And that is called?
Yeah, we call it the right temporoparietal junction, or
sure we do.
RTPJ. It's just a little brain region above and behind your right ear.
Okay.
And it's called temporoparietal junction because it's somewhere near the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe. But really what we know about it is not so, we know where it is, but what's interesting isn't where it is in your brain, but what it's doing. And that's basically one of the things my lab does, is study this brain region and figure out how does that brain region's activity let us think about thoughts.
Again, you're doing this, we talked about this yesterday, through neuroimaging, and that's how
right.
You're finding this out. Okay, so explain to me a little bit about its RTPJ. How does it exactly work?
Well, how does it exactly work is what I would love to know. But I'll give you an example of the kind of problem it lets you solve. So this is the kind of problem I would be giving you if you were a person in one of my experiments. So imagine you're lying in a dark tube, you got to stay completely still, and you're there for an hour so you can, relax. And while you're lying in this tube and we're taking pictures of your brain, I'm just going to give you stories to read and think about. And at the end of each story, you're going to make a moral judgment. How much moral blame does the character in the story deserve? Okay, you ready? I'm going to give you a story.
I'm going.
This is a story about Grace. Grace is on a tour of a chemical factory with a friend of hers, and the tour stops for a break, and Grace is getting coffee. Her friend says, "Can you get me coffee, and I'd like sugar." So Grace goes to get the cups of coffee. Next to the coffee machine is a jar of white powder labeled dangerous toxic poison. So Grace thinks that that powder is a dangerous toxic poison, and she puts some of it in her friend's coffee. Actually, that powder was just sugar, and when her friend drinks the coffee, she's completely fine. Now, do you think that Grace deserves moral blame for putting the powder in the coffee?
Yes.
Yeah. Now here, let me tell you the opposite story. In this story, everything's the same. Grace is on a tour of a chemical factory. Next to the coffee machine is a jar of powder. And the powder is labeled sugar. Because it's labeled sugar and it's a jar of white powder next to the coffee machine, Grace thinks that the powder is sugar. She puts some of that powder in her friend's coffee, but actually, that sugar was contaminated with a dangerous toxic poison. So when her friend drinks the coffee, she gets sick and dies. Now, does Grace deserve moral blame for having put the powder in the coffee?
No, because her intentions were good.
Exactly. And so what's amazing about people is I just told you two stories. In the first story, Grace's friend drank a cup of sugared coffee and was totally fine. In the second story, Grace's friend died. But you said that Grace deserved blame for the first one and not the second one. And that shows that you, like most healthy human beings, can overcome what happens in the world. Even this huge difference between a perfectly happy friend and a dead friend, you can overcome that and interpret these actions morally in terms of Grace's intentions, what she thought and intended. And that's what this brain region lets you do.
And you say it's exclusively this brain region. It's not involved in other things?
Well, there's two different versions of what you just said. So one is, can this brain region do it by itself, or does it need other brain regions to help? And definitely it needs other brain regions to help. So we know that this particular brain region, this one, we know it contributes something special, but for sure it couldn't do it in isolation. Everything you do with a bit of your brain, you're doing with many, many parts that are communicating. But what we do know is that this brain region is contributing something pretty specific to your moral judgments. And part of how we know that is we can actually take somebody like you, a perfectly healthy, typical person, and temporarily interfere with function in just that brain region. And when we do that, we can change your moral judgments in a particular way. You can still make moral judgments, but you just change what you think of those two cases. You think that the one where she thought it was poison is not so bad because nothing bad actually happened. And the one where she thought it was sugar is more bad because the friend died. Just when we've interfered with function in this one brain region.
We're going to talk a little bit later about how you interfere with this brain region of mine, but I want to show a bit of tape, and this is of a standard puzzle you use to observe the development of children, realizing that people can have different beliefs. You alluded to that earlier. Then they're on. Let's take a look at this.
This is the first pirate. His name is Ivan. And you know what pirates really like?
What?
Pirates really like cheese sandwiches.
Cheese. I love cheese.
Yeah. So Ivan has his cheese sandwich and he says, yum, 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 yum. I really love cheese sandwiches. And Ivan puts his sandwich over here on top of the pirate chest. And Ivan says, you know what? I need a drink with my lunch. And so Ivan goes to get a drink. And while Ivan is away, the wind comes, and it blows the sandwich down onto the grass. And now, here comes the other pirate. This pirate is called Joshua. See? And Joshua also really loves cheese sandwich. So Joshua has a cheese sandwich, and he says, yum, 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 yum. I love cheese sandwiches. And he puts his cheese sandwich over here on top of the pirate chest.
So that one is his.
That one's Joshua's. That's right.
And then his went on the ground.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Now.
So he won't know which one is his.
Oh, so now Joshua goes off to get a drink. So Ivan comes back and he says, I want my cheese sandwich. So which one do you think Ivan's going to take?
I think he was going to take that one.
Yeah, you think he's going to take that one? All right, let's see.
I told you.
Oh, yeah, you were right. He took that one.
That looks like pretty fun lab work.
Absolutely. So that's basically the kid version of the same problem that I gave you.
How old?
That one's 5 years old.
Okay.
And at 5 years old, kids have got this part of the problem down. So he knew, as you saw, that 5-year-old boy knew what was going to happen, that the one pirate would think it was his cheese sandwich and would take the other pirate's cheese sandwich. What's really interesting, though, is that, well, there's two things. One thing that's really interesting is what happens with younger kids,
Okay,
3-year-olds.
I have a 2-year-old, so tell me what happens at her
Well,
birth.
2 is a little young, but when she's 3, you should give her this problem, because 3-year-olds give an amazing answer. They don't understand about other people's having false beliefs. And so if you give a 3-year-old a version of this problem, and you ask, which sandwich is he wants his cheese sandwich. Which one is he going to take? They predict he will take his cheese sandwich.
No matter where it is.
No matter where it is, no matter what happened. They'll pay perfectly good attention. But if he says he wants his cheese sandwich, they'll say he will take his cheese sandwich because they haven't been able to figure out yet that people could have false beliefs. It's by the time they're 5, they've got, as this kid did, the one you just saw, they've got the idea of false beliefs down in this context for action prediction, right? So the 5-year-old knows because he falsely believes that sandwich is his, he will accidentally take the other pirate's cheese sandwich. That's about as harm as you can get in a story you tell to a 5-year-old. What's really interesting with a 5-year-old is if you then ask them the moral problem. So just like I asked you about a moral question, what happens next in that story is Joshua comes back, the one whose cheese sandwich has just been taken, comes back, sees Ivan eating his cheese sandwich, and starts to cry. And now the question is Ivan being mean and naughty for eating Joshua's sandwich? Now 3-year-olds say yes, because they don't understand why it happened. But interestingly, even 5-year-olds say yes, because even though they knew why Ivan took Joshua's sandwich, even though they understood about false beliefs, it turns out that using that information to make a moral judgment takes a little more sophistication. And so this is something that kids are really working through between when they're 5 and 6, and it's not until they're around 7 that they say what we would say, which is Ivan was not being mean and naughty, he just thought it was his sandwich.
So what does this tell us about how developed, if that's the right word, the RPTJ part of our brain is?
TPJ.
See, yeah, I knew I'd get it wrong. Between a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, and say an 11-year-old.
Well, part of what is amazing with modern neuroimaging is now, instead of guessing, which I used to have to do, I can actually look at the right TPJ in a 5 and a 7 and an 11-year-old. And that's actually what we do in my lab. So we are having hundreds of little kids, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old kids, come to our lab, and we take pictures of their brain while they're thinking about exactly these kinds of stories. And what we've discovered is that at exactly the time and age that they're figuring out how to solve these kinds of problems, their right TPJ is changing what it does. Basically, it starts out as a brain region that kind of helps you think about anything social. But as you get older, it gets more and more specialized. So instead of doing anything, it just does this one job of helping you think about thoughts.
So that means, and is an adult any different than, say, an 11-year-old? Does it get more and more specialized?
Well, certainly you can just guess from knowing 11-year-olds that we think adults must be different from 11-year-olds in some ways, but at least in this particular measure, so in terms of how specialized the right TPJ is, it looks so far, this is a new experiment, but it looks like around age 12, kids are starting to look like adults.
During this experiment, you look at a number of different kids and stuff, and I'm just wondering, does culture or background or other forms of development play into how they respond to this test?
Yeah, so this is work that's been done by many scientists all over the world, as I said, actually starting here in Canada. And people have asked, just with that simple problem, the problem you saw, the pirates problem, how does when you start getting that answer right depend on things like culture or your family or whatever? And there's 2 parts to that answer. The first part is that basically it's culturally universal. So you can do that, a version of that task with kids here in Canada or in the mountains of Peru or in a hunter-gatherer group in Western Africa, and you'll get about the same age estimates, that about at age 3, they're getting it 100% systematically wrong. By age around 5, they're getting it 100% right. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is we also know a whole bunch of things that can change that developmental story. One of the really interesting ones is kids with older siblings do better. And it looks like maybe if you have a sibling just a little bit older than you, you get a lot of practice thinking about this kind of thing.
The stealing of my sandwich.
Exactly.
Okay, so take it from finger puppets and children to the broader context. What does this explain about how we judge what other people are thinking and doing?
Well, so you knew from the answers you gave to the problem I posed you at the beginning, you knew that you did think about other people's thoughts when you make moral judgments. And so what we wanted to know is, well, how does this brain region let you do it? And can we study, you know, it's kind of an amazing idea that I could study the brain region that does something as abstract as thinking about other people's thoughts. So the first question was just, can we do that at all, right? Can we study that brain region? And what we've been doing is showing that we can find the brain region. As I told you, we can interfere with it, but we can also start to see the pattern of activity inside that brain region that's doing that job. So one of the things we've been doing recently in my lab is studying the differences between different people, right? So I gave you an example that most people agree on. If I give you a more intermediate case, we'll be able to see that people actually kind of disagree about accidents. In some accidents, it's definitely totally okay, but some accidents, people disagree whether you should be blamed because you caused harm, or you should be forgiven because you didn't mean to. And when we look at those cases, we can actually see what's the pattern in this brain region that makes the difference between people who go with the intention, say you shouldn't be blamed, and the people who go with the outcome and say you should be blamed. The other thing we're using this for, as I said, is to study autism. So one of the things that we've discovered is that people who have autism tend to go with the outcome. They tend to say that they tend to blame people even for accidents. And we've shown that this pattern that we can see in the brain of typical people is not there in people with autism when they're doing this kind of problem.
You mentioned a couple of times about how you actually study the brain, and it's by applying this magnetic pulse. I just want to show a little bit of that to our audience about the machinery you use.
Mm-hmm. So now I'm going to apply that same pulse to my brain, to the part of my brain that controls my hand. So there's no physical force, just a magnetic pulse.
Rebecca?
Yep.
Ready?
Yep.
Like every good scientist, you volunteer yourself first for the experiment. What is that magnetic pulse doing to the brain region it's directed at?
Yeah, so that's a tool called transcranial magnetic stimulation, that tool, the figure 8 coil that you saw. And what that does is it generates a brief pulse of a magnetic field. Now, I mentioned earlier, the way one brain region communicates with another is by sending an electrical message. So if we can create briefly this very brief, very strong changing magnetic field around a group of brain cells, it causes them to basically suddenly all fire, but in a very unnatural way. Normally they'd be firing in a carefully organized pattern, and here we just create a burst that's not like the normal pattern at all. And that has two consequences. What you saw, which is, for example, if we do that to the part of the brain that moves my hand, you get that brief movement of my hand.
Involuntary movement.
Well, controlled by the TMS machine, right? But so one of the things to know about that is, as you saw, although the magnetic pulse is very strong, by the time it gets through my thick skull to my brain, it's a pretty small effect, right? It just makes my hand twitch. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is that just for a few milliseconds after that, when the cells are kind of recovering from having been pulsed that way, there's just these few milliseconds when they don't do their normal job as well as they otherwise would. And so, for example, if we know we're interested in the right TPJ, we can give you a moral problem, like the story I told you about Grace. Just before you go to make your moral judgment, I put a little TMS right in that brain region. So that brain region's temporarily disorganized. It's not as good as it normally would be at its usual job. And during that moment, you have to make your moral judgment. And then we can see that your moral judgment is biased. It's not the moral judgment you would have made otherwise. But then a few milliseconds later, the effect of TMS is gone. And now you make a normal moral judgment
Give me an example of that. You've done this in your lab. You've given someone a moral problem, zapped them. What's changed?
Right. So in the stories that I told you, right, I gave you the example of Grace and the chemical factory. So for a very brief window immediately after having TMS to your right TPJ, what we see is that people's moral judgments shift. Now they depend a little more on what actually happened and a little less on what Grace thought. So for accidents, immediately after that kind of TMS, people say that she deserves a little more blame. For the failed attempts, they say she deserves a little less blame.
The accident being she killed her friend.
The accident is she killed her friend thinking it was sugar.
The failed attempt.
The failed attempt, she gave her friend what she thought was poison, but nothing bad happened.
So it manipulates it. It makes it, for a brief period, whenever it's getting that magnetic pulse.
It changes the trade-off, that's right.
And how long does it last for?
Well, it depends exactly how you do it, but never more than an hour, and usually not more than a minute.
Up to an hour. I mean, you're tampering with another person's morality, really, by doing this. Sounds pretty scary.
Well, we keep them under observation for the hour before we let them back out.
But I guess the more serious question from that, I mean, this kind of approach, do you ever worry that it could fall under the wrong person's hands, be used in an insidious sort of way?
Well, this kind of moral judgment that we're studying is not the kind that can get insidious. This is not like the moral judgment that decides whether to pull the trigger. It's more like the moral judgment that the jury makes after the fact. These are third-person, after-the-fact judgments. So I don't ask you, are you going to put the poison in the coffee? What I say is, here's what Grace did. What do you think? And I actually think it's a really interesting question. What are the brain regions that we use in the heat of the moment? Actually, this gets back to something we talked about last time about the choice to suppress an action even if it's available, right? You see that poison right there. Your brain is making the option of using it readily available. And another part of your brain is saying, no, no, don't do that, suppress, that's a bad idea. So that trade-off in your brain between an action you could do and the inhibition that tells you not to do it, that's probably much more at stake when you go to act yourself. Whereas the stuff I study is more like, you know, you're watching a movie, you're reading a novel, you're seeing a court case, and in the third person you have to decide, is that person a good person or a bad person? Which is also incredibly important to the functioning of society, right? We want people to make the right third person moral judgment. But if they make the wrong one, it's not going to lead to death.
Another part of your research, well, another example that you use in your research is this idea of Romeo and Juliet. So tell me about that one.
Well, so we use that as an example to just give you a sense of how amazingly good people are at understanding other people's thoughts and beliefs. If you think about what would the play Romeo and Juliet, imagine trying to watch that play without ever being able to think about the thoughts of the characters. So what happens? Two people are in love, and they're going to get married. They have a plan to run away and get married, and then one of them kills herself and the other one kills himself. It doesn't make any kind of sense at all, right? The fact that Romeo and Juliet makes sense to us and is also a horrible tragedy depends on our being able to understand that Juliet falsely thought that Romeo was dead, that she would have known that he was alive if she had only waited a little longer, right? All of these false messages, false beliefs, they're kind of at the heart of both comedy and tragedy. And I think they're also at the heart of the nature of the human mind.
You talked about juries, and that what you're really studying is a jury's reaction. Have you looked at have you studied how juries react in criminal cases and things like that?
No, so the kind of thing we study is more like the basic foundations. I've never done any work that looks at applying it in a real context.
You talked earlier a little bit about your work in helping out to try and figure out what causes autism. I'm wondering, is this going to help at a treatment down the road?
Well, that's obviously one of the ideals. One idea that we have about how imaging could help is that right now there's a number of different treatments that are available, but different treatments work for different people. And this is not just true of autism, actually. This is true in general of many developmental diseases. It's true of autism, it's true of dyslexia, it's true of depression. There's many different treatments available, and it's hard to know in advance which one is going to help which person. And so one of the things doctors find themselves having to do is try one thing, and if that fails, try the next thing, and if that fails, try the next thing. Well, that's a really long time of failure as you're going from one possible treatment to another. So one of the ideas we have for a way that neuroimaging could really help is if we could look at your brain as soon as we know there's something wrong, and not just say, yes, you have autism, or yes, you have dyslexia, but also say, you have the kind of dyslexia that would be best helped by this treatment, or you have the kind of depression where the best treatment would be this kind of plan. If we could do that, it would save both the people paying for all of these failed treatments a lot of money, but also it would save all the patients all that time of going through one failure after another before they found the thing that worked.
I know scientists never like saying how long this is going to take because you're still the research lab, but I mean, when is this really going to have practical effects in things like autism? Do you think it's 5 years out, 10 years out?
Autism is an incredibly complicated and hard disease to understand, and actually the more that I've studied autism in the last 10 years, the more I appreciate how complicated this disease really is. I think that we're probably closer to having neuroimaging be helpful in the way I described for things like dyslexia, actually, where some of my colleagues at MIT are already beginning to make progress using neuroimaging to identify which are the kids who are most likely to improve from the current treatment as usual.
Rebecca Saxe, lovely to meet you. Very interesting stuff. Keep up the good work. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.